Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going to be talking about the books that I've been reading this week. I'm in a new location, I will be for a couple of weeks. And there's a little dog who's just off camera. Hang on, there we go. Hey, little Bubs. He'll resurface at some point. He's going to pop his head back up. He's just having a little lie down. Where was I? The books I've been reading this week. I hope you've been having a really good week, and let's get talking about some of these books. First up, I'm continuing on with my Booker project more generally, and also just really enjoying actually reading some Sarah Waters for once after years of kind of skirting around it. I read The Little Stranger, and I really enjoyed this. I mean, it feels like such a redundant thing after all these years, and with her being such a beloved author, to kind of be like, oh, she's pretty good. But I read Fingersmith earlier in the year, and partly for the Booker project and partly because I've been meaning to read it forever. And my goodness, it's good. And The Little Stranger I really enjoyed as well. The core idea behind this is almost reminds me a little bit of The Remains of the Day, at least the opening part. There's essentially a big old country house, and the family who live there it had its sort of heyday and was this sort of really glorious place, and families and kids would come and visit and all of these things. Our main character, or the narrator of the story, is a traveling doctor, but as a child he visited this place and was able to look around and has these fond memories of it. But we see going forward in time to when he's a doctor, he revisits to see to a patient who's living there, a young woman who's working there as a maid. And he realizes how it's sort of fallen to rack and ruin, and it's this very strange place that's very, very different from what it used to be. And in the midst of that, we also see the kind of complications that come for that family. They are financially not really in a position to be able to keep up the place, and it's falling further and further into disrepair. And a particularly sort of pivotal set of moments happen that make that even worse. And without spoiling anything about those parts, this eventually leads to a conversation and a sort of feeling around the house that there's a ghost or some kind of phantasm who is there ruining lives and kind of cursing the people who live there. And so what we see really that comes from it is this really strange scenario of people slowly, it's not necessarily losing the plot, but really struggling to hold on to reality in some ways. And they become increasingly convinced that this spirit or whatever is there, and is cursing them, is making their lives more difficult. And I just thought this book really beautifully achieves all of that. There's a sort of a really creeping feel of tension in this book, that things are slowly getting worse and worse, not only financially for the family, hello there Chilly, not only sort of financially worse for the family, but also the kind of their grip on reality and the sort of conversations around this spirit are getting worse and worse. And I just think there's something really special about the way she achieves this kind of singular focus on, hello there, Bubba. Okay, that's just your bum there. I'll just cover that up. There you go. Hey little one. Yeah, and I just think it's really well done, basically. I think it's a great book. And yeah, I totally see why this was shortlisted for the Booker as well. And it's sort of making me want to read even more of hers beyond the Booker project as well. Next up, a book I've been wanting to read for a really long time, and that is Selamlik by Khaled Alesmael, and translated from the Arabic by Leni Price. And this is a really interesting book in several ways. It's interestingly, I should sort of state from the beginning here, the author, I think, has sort of said that the cover wasn't necessarily his choice, although it to some degree does speak to some of the contents of the book, but it also maybe doesn't fully give the picture of what the entire book is about. So the kind of crux of this book is that our main character is a gay man in Syria, and he is basically, with sort of some of the political instability that comes up, and also sort of various other things, and particularly being gay there, he seeks to move, and sort of through various sets of sort of happenings, he essentially ends up in Sweden. And so a large part of the book is talking about this kind of pre-life, the kind of the the sort of secretive but very freeing in some ways encounters he has in Syria. I mean, it's really interesting actually. I think this book does something really clever here, which is actually a lot of his gay life in Sweden is relatively dull and flat, and a lot of his sort of sexual awakenings and experiences in Syria are these really, they're very undercover, they're very covert, but there's also something really powerful and beautiful and enriching about them. And I think it's a clever sort of twist on that narrative, which is typically that people, can only be their true selves in another place. And so we spend a lot of the book with kind of speaking about these places, these Selamlik, which are these essentially areas where it's only men, and because it's only men, whether it's sort of student dorms or kind of whatever, there's a kind of freedom of men often walking around naked or whatever that kind of allows a sort of covert sort of understanding of who is maybe interested as well. And the book kind of takes us through him eventually ending up in Sweden, which mirrors parts of the author's own life as well. But I think what's also really interesting in some other ways, I think, is that the book really plays around with I suppose reality in some ways. Sometimes the book will take a sort of left turn and will, I turned right when I was doing that, but it will take a left turn and will focus on sort of, like almost like an orgiastic kind of moment where it sort of is much more almost like erotica as a novel. And then other times it will just have these really beautiful passages about a love of home or something else. And so this book kind of freeforms, where sometimes you realize that there's a whole scene happening that isn't really real. It's sort of almost an erotic dream or something. And so I think the book plays a lot with that kind of narrative structure. Towards the end, I did think that there were some moments where I felt like it sort of detracted slightly from the there you go, Bubba. Hey, little one. Hey, yeah. Where it sort of detracted slightly from the kind of the poignancy of the other story being told, but I still think this book is really beautiful in many, many ways. And I think it does something really fun and creative with narrative that was just really beautiful as well. Next up, a kind of unexpected one. It was just sort of something we'd been considering for a book club that I'm part of, and I kind of just thought it sounded interesting. It's a set of short stories by Rupert Everett, the actor, called The American No. And the title comes from this idea of sort of casting agents in the US who, instead of saying, sorry, we don't think you're right for this film, will say, oh my God, we love you, you're amazing, oh my God, you should totally be part of this, and then you never hear from them again. But the book kind of pulls on this, these almost feel like very interconnected stories, even though they are sort of ostensibly sort of separated, but it feels like there is a core character who is an actor who is telling you the stories from across their life. And so in some ways it feels almost like not autobiographical, but it feels like Rupert Everett is drawing on things he definitely knows. And these are a wild set of short stories. There is a story that is all about essentially a sort of an escort picking up people in a cafe. There is all kinds of weird and wonderful things. There's a short story about a trip through India. There are quite a few stories about sort of awful actors being awful. It's just sort of a really fun selection. And I think particularly there's something quite interesting about the way that these are done, where there's almost an introductory preamble before each short story that feels like it again kind of pulls you back to this central character who's saying, well, you thought that was strange, well, hear about this other thing that I've got to tell you, and here's where it all happened when I was traveling through India. There's a kind of this interesting preamble, and it kind of threads it together where it almost feels at times like you sort of forget that you're reading short stories, and this feels almost like it could be a sort of an autobiographical thing, a sort of memoir in sort of little pieces from Rupert Everett itself. But it's really funny and raucous and silly, but there is quite a lot of poignancy here as well. There are kind of some heartfelt moments in amongst it, but it's mostly just very beautifully silly, which I really enjoyed. And last but not least, I read The Applicant by Nazli Koca. I am probably massively mispronouncing that name. But this is a really short and kind of focused novel. I really loved the point of view of this. So it's a young woman called Layla, And she is a Turkish woman living in Germany, in Berlin specifically, and working sort of various odd jobs, but particularly a cleaner throughout a lot of this book. And she is essentially caught in the kind of crossroads of various things. So not only being a Turkish woman in Germany and the kind of, already feeling slightly isolated. Linguistically, she's fairly isolated because she doesn't speak much German. She's doing a job that doesn't often involve talking to a lot of people. And a large part of the novel is also her talking about things that she's found while she's cleaning up rooms, which are often things like recyclable bottles, where in Germany you get like a bit of money back. Sort of you pay an extra 5-10 cents or whatever when you buy something, you get those back when you return it. And so she kind of collects up these things and takes them back, and she'll say, oh, I got like €3.10 worth of fand back, all these kind of things. And so it almost has that kind of almost like Bridget Jones's Diary, where you get those little diary things of like 2,000 calories, good, or whatever. But you have these little almost intros to the beginning of each diary entry. But I think the really fascinating thing about this, and although I kind of lost part of the kind of tone of this towards the end of it, I really loved how this started, and I think there's a really startling voice in this book that's really well done. She is this sort of character who, to some degree, is a bit done with all of this. She's working a fairly basic job, doing this sort of cleaning job that doesn't sort of, it tires her out, but she doesn't feel particularly fulfilled by it. Not to demean cleaners, but she herself in the book is pretty done with it. And she, kind of almost lives for these little moments where she gets to go and do something else. But her life outside of this is quite complicated, with various sort of dramas and interpersonal relationship things. And it's all a bit kind of complicated, but she also uses this to sort of meditate on what it means to be an outsider. And so we often see her talking about, being a Turkish woman in Germany, particularly because there's a fairly large and established Turkish population. Many Turkish people are sort of surprised because she hasn't really been there long enough to really embed herself in that side of things. She doesn't really speak enough German to be seen as German, and she mostly communicates in English. But equally, on top of that, the book kind of uses this to talk about the crossroads of various other things. So the ways that someone being an immigrant or having kind of uncertain visa status in a country can really change things. And so although the character opens the book by talking about how she can't be bothered to submit this document that would kind of confirm her visa status, because it also involves doing some other stuff and she, sort of is a bit checked out. We also sort of see how there are various things where characters she interacts with say, oh, why don't you just go and do this thing? And she's like, that is not open for me. I can't do that thing because of my status. And so the book kind of meditates on quite a lot of these things in a really interesting way, I think, and also allows her to explore the kind of her sort of a very odd romantic life, which at one point involves sort of being whisked away, and her kind of, kind of not necessarily loving it, but also kind of needing it. It's a very strange book in that respect. I really enjoyed it. It's a very sort of short, focused book, and I think it says a lot and does a lot. And particularly, I find that kind of point of view from the main character, from Layla, so well done throughout the book. I think, particularly towards the beginning, it's really punchy and really fiery, and it's really captivating. So those have been the books that I've read this week. I hope you're doing really, really well. I hope you've had a great week, and speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.